So, hello everybody. It's great to be here. And first of all, I would like to thank Transborder Art Director Graciela Casal for inviting us today around this panel discussion. And the title of this panel discussion is New Geographies of Art. So before starting our discussion, I would like to introduce our distinguished panelists. But first, myself. My name is Hakan Topal. I'm originally from Ankara, Turkey. I'm an artist living in Brooklyn, and also I'm teaching at SUNY Purchase College as assistant professor of new media and art and design. So since the beginnings of 2000s, I've been, as an artist, urban sociologist, and a member of Ex-Urban Collective, I have been researching complex social, political, and cultural issues of neoliberal urban development, gentrification, ecological exploitation, as well as the rising repressive state and forced containment, especially in the context of Turkey. So next panelist is Thao Lam, is an artist based in New York. She is originally from Vietnam. She teaches at the School of Art, Media, and Technology at Parsons. Her artistic practice is at the intersection of research, object making, installation, film, video, writing, and performance. Since 2001, she has been active part of an artist collective, Lin plus Lam, producing projects about immigration, sites of residual trauma, national identity, and historical memory. Lan Thao holds an MFA from California Institute of Arts, and she was a Whitney Museum Independent Study Fellow, and considers her experiences in refugee camps and housing projects also part of her education. So third, we have Mariam Ghani. She's an artist, Lebanese and Afghani artist, writer, filmmaker, and teacher. Her research-based practice includes video, installation, photography, performance, and text. She holds an BA in comparative literature from NYU and MFA from SVA, and currently teaches at Cooper Union and in the social practice MFA program at Queens College. Mariam's latest work, The City and the City, offers a poetic investigation of Michael Brown's death in Ferguson, Missouri.
The construction site had been abandoned at least 5 years before, judging from the trees growing on the mound of excavated dirt. I was lying in the dirt, where I had been abandoned, like whatever project had once been planned here. Nothing is still like the dead are still. The wind moves their hair as it moved mine, and they don't respond at all. My body was in an ugly pose, with legs crooked as if about to get up. My face was set in a startled strain, endlessly surprised by myself. My normal expression shattered like glass. It was impossible to say, looking at this shell, what I had looked like, what face those who knew me would see if they heard my name. The detective looked at me and saw a series of jagged tears and splits, a disassembled body. I looked unseeingly up at her, up at myself, blank as any mirror tilted in the wrong direction. This detective was not a policewoman. She was too unofficial for that, though the fact that she was permitted on the site meant she probably had been official once. She had some other purpose here. She represented some other interest. We were out of the way, but I could feel attention on us like insects, women and men leaning from windows in apartment buildings and haphazardly parked cars to inspect the rites of disaster. There were other buildings around as well, and other men and other women, of course, who were carefully not watching us, who were carefully not noticing my body, stripped in death of its identifying markers, of anything that made it safe to see, to know. Do you know anything about my city? Like most cities, it believes itself to be its own country, with its own laws and borders and customs. But unlike perhaps your city, it has made that belief into reality. Like many cities that appear to be one city or one country, it's actually two.
Mariam created the video while completing a fellowship at Washington University. During that time, as we all know, Brown was killed by a police officer, igniting large protests led by the Black Lives Matter movement. The film is currently presented at Ryan Lee Gallery, accompanied with a small selection of photographs. And lastly, Alex Villar. He was born in Brazil and resides in New York. Working between performance, video, and photography, Alex poetically and humorously explores the hidden sides of power and spaces of survival in contemporary life. Alex studied at Hunter College, the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program, like Thao, Helio Alonso College, and Escalo de Artes Visuais do Parque Lage. Is it true? And, close to. He teaches, usually teaches at this new school. So today's panel discussion, as I said, is New Geographies of Art. I think this is an extremely timely discussion, considering the fact that in the US, and of course we mentioned that the Black Lives Matter movement and the rise of xenophobia and racism, especially in the context of the Trump campaign. And last couple of months, there have been some developments. Obviously, one of them is Brexit, the rise of nationalism and xenophobia in Europe in general, and also in Colombia, the rejection of the peace deal with the guerrillas, right? On the one hand, these are like a kind of issues that is being like a kind of brewing for a long time in the West. And in the East, in general, Africa and the Middle East, there is this counter developments which can be summarized under both nationalism but also Islamofascism. So considering I'm from Turkey, I follow the developments in Turkey but also larger Middle East, and I see that like there are these tendencies kind of going hand in hand. So in this panel discussion, probably we will be discussing some of the artistic responses that is produced in response to these urgencies. And I'm gonna like give the ground to Alex. So perhaps he can articulate more questions and we can start our conversation. Yeah.
Sounds good. So I thought before we reach that point, before we reach the artistic responses to that we could back up a little bit and then start at where we started, so to speak. We are all here practicing artists that live in New York, but we all came from another place. And I thought this gives a very good opportunity to think about the border. I mean, the name of this series is Transborder. And the border is a line. The border is a drawing, and in the drawing that defines a limit between a here, if you are on this site, and an elsewhere that lies beyond that border. And in artistic terms, the name Here and Elsewhere is known as a film, a collaborative film by Godard Mervieux, and also using footage from a few years back that Godard did with Moran about Palestine. So in Here and Elsewhere, this film that was done 40 years ago, the war of Palestine is brought here. Here is France for them. And they began to create a relationship. It was not just the gesture of bringing the war home, but also in understanding the relationships of the center and the periphery, the here and the elsewhere, and the other types of defining lines. They were a place in the space of domesticity, but also in the space of consumption. Martha Rosler did also a piece called Bringing the Vietnam Home, Bringing the War Home, in which she brought the Vietnam War home in collage with photographs of suburban houses. And by doing so, establishing a clear relationship between consumerism and war. So here we have like a precedent, a very informative precedent for us, but from 40 years down the road, things have changed. Some of us would have expected that the changes would have possibly dissolved those borders, but what we see, as Hakan began to indicate, is a re-entrenchment of those borders. On one side, we have the crossing of threshold and this growing migration flows that are happening both in Syria, North Africa, but also, as recently as UN described, large inflows of people in Central America. So it's a global phenomenon, but at the same time, not only in reaction to it, but also in part, this growing xenophobia and this kind of reassertion of national boundaries and identities. So this is an initial framework. And with that, I just want to ask you to very simply to tell us if there is a war that you also bring from elsewhere home. What is the war that engages you, that's happening and elsewhere, that could be the place where you came from or the place in relation to which you remain attached, and that it correlates to what's happening here, but also globally.
Okay, well, you put up a lot of things there, a lot of threads that we could pull. But to address your last question first, the idea of bringing the war home was something I worked with a lot in my early work. It was specifically the sort of global war on terror that I was interested in at that moment. And even more specifically, the US invasion of Afghanistan. I actually made a piece called Friendly Fire in 2003 where I was looking at this sort of gun camera footage that was of US bombing of Afghanistan that was being shown on the news at that time, and like very, very literally kind of performing it as being superimposed on my own body. And this was this kind of moment that for me was a really interesting split because I am Afghan American, of feeling myself as being in this position of being both the bomber and the target, right? And I was interested in, kind of pushing that a little bit further and thinking about, in that era, which was still a relatively innocent era when people thought wars could be kept in their separate boxes, thinking about, how can viewers be brought to realize the really intimate connections that exist between, the wars we wage elsewhere and the effects that they are inevitably going to have back at home. And I think over, the decade plus that this war has actually extended, many people have come to that realization. I think it has become like a commonplace to think that, but I think in the very beginning of it, it was not a commonplace. So yeah.
Thao, perhaps you want to jump in?
Sure, absolutely. Well, you bring up Bringing the War Home series from Martha Rosler, and of course, being Vietnamese Canadian now, it definitely resonates for me, even when I was at grad school. But funnily enough, about last year, when I joined the faculty at Parson, I got a new office, and I entered the office, and there is Martha Rosler, because the new school has an art collection. So there is actually a copy of Martha Rosler Bringing the War Home in my office right now. So, so that was already like close to my heart, my appreciation for the work, that to bring this kind of notion of violence and domesticity and the collision of those spaces. But another collision that happened, and it's just mere coincidence, I got this space. The key to that office is stamp B52.
Oh, wow.
So coincidence? Yes, absolutely. But so I carry that B-52 now that I opened to enter that office. I think that violence and I cannot not address this kind of historical moment that we're in, that it does have a trajectory. It has a long history. So this rise of xenophobia, this what is happening now in the world, I've been witnessing it since I entered the world. Actually, it's in 2000 when the second Bush became into power. There's a Tea Party, and then therefore the rejection of President Obama's legitimacy of power. So Trumpism is not new, and it's happening for me also to witness how that the shift of politics, conservatism in Canada. We had for over a decade a very conservative prime minister. On the personal level, in the work that I do, coincidence things happens that I made work about the Vietnam War, and I thought I was done with the kind of the violence, because it is, after all, many years after the fact, and now Vietnam is reunited as one country under socialist communist party. I thought I was done, and then there's a project that that took about 6 years in research and completion. It's called Unidentified Vietnam, and that was a kind of, again, chance discovery at the Library of Congress that they, at the end of the Vietnam War, 1975, the diplomatic embassy of South Vietnam at the end of the war donated all the material, including films and propaganda films, I should say, and newspaper, magazine, to the Library of Congress. So it's been sitting in dormant. And so in 2000, I started working. I found this material just by chance, because the librarian said, "Oh, you're Vietnamese. Do you want to take a look at this thing?" Right? So then we cannot escape history in a way. So then I work on a project that I thought was done. So the war that we bring with us, or that we inherit, is constant, I think. And how, I'm always interested in how each artist have voice and speak to it in different ways.
Yeah, I remember. I think it feels like 9/11 was a kind of a turning point, a large event that kind of characterizes what's happening now, because of the mistakes that precisely you put the Bush administration made, right? I remember 9/11, I was in New York, my mom called, and everybody was crying, right, from Turkey. And then after that, I went to Europe and Turkey, and when I was telling them that I was from New York, it was a great sympathy and affection that they were sharing the pain, right? Even with a Turkish person who just lives there, right? As I was at the time a tourist, right? I didn't have a work permit, but I was here. It was a relatively open society, and over the years I kind of witnessed I call this Israelization of the U.S., right? Becoming the security becoming the main paradigm, defining what can be done, what will be done, and of course Afghan and Iraq wars. And so I'm interested, my work, I did a lot of work related with this kind of a moment of post-catastrophe, if you will, post-political catastrophe. And in Europe, I look at what happened to immigrant subjects. Because after the wars, and of all these people could be like part of a larger peaceful democratic moment, they were pushed into a kind of a radical position because they were seen as a security threat, right? Becomes like suddenly you are part of the society in one day, and then second day you are seen as a security threat. And I look at these sites, such as small mosques. We call them masjids, right? They are open everywhere. How these places, but similar to yoga places, martial arts centers, these places are post-industrial places of gatherings. Because like it used to be that, I mean, there in 60s, 70s, 80s, immigration was largely characterized by the workers, right? Workers moved and then worked. And then that was this kind of association, democratic association within the workplace or universities, right? And then decline, after neoliberalism, decline of these associations kind of fulfilled by these membership-based organizations. So I'm interested in a way that what is the possibilities that, because this is the byproduct of larger processes that we are presented. And then these people who are radicalized because of the conditions that they are forced into, so how do we de-radicalize and then reintroduce those contingencies to the democratic aspects of societies? This, for me, is an important question. So I wonder, like.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would like to contend on that, but before, I'm going to hold you to the question: is this the war that you're bringing from home, or there is something that precedes that?
I think it's a good question. I think this whole colonial history and colonial histories and colonial subjects being actually cannot be contained in the colonial territory. I think you're absolutely right. There's a long history of colonialism and Western exploitation of the resources, but obviously they could not be contained within that territory. So colonialization actually reflected itself in their Western home countries, right? In variety of ways, through managerial practices, but also like those subjects were still considered colonial subject. I think that you're absolutely right. There are two layers that going side by side, or
perhaps precedes that. I'm thinking back to my own experience, like my own response to that question is like I bring two wars from home with me. One also a long time ago, like 50 years ago, which is the defining events of my own generation in Brazil, which is this military coup that imposed a dictatorship for over 20 years in Brazil. And bookending that experience, there's another coup now in Brazil underway, which is very differently implemented without the military force, but with the full force of the law, which is a movement that's entirely consistent with neoliberalism. But nevertheless, two coups, and the two of them sustain connections with the US, this empire that we were a minute ago contemplating with the sign of the Empire State behind us. So that moment is very formative because it has a few elements that are intertwined. One is, of course, the state. The other is the phenomenon of the school, and the site of the school is twofold. One, in the case of the first revolution in Brazil, well, the military called the revolution, the coup, I insist, is the School of Americas, which is where officials from the military in Brazil were trained in the techniques of torture and domestic control. Now, it's the School of Chicago that provides, the economic school of Chicago that provides the mindset for the neoliberalist model for it to be implemented. And both of them collapse on the school, which is the site of the students who are attempting to form the new generation. They were repressed in 64 to 68, and now they are being repressed. The current event in Brazil now is what it's being called like a high school spring. More than 1,000 schools throughout the country are now occupied by young students. I mean, they're 16-year-old at most. And what they're reacting against is a few things. One of them, a new measure that's completely defunding investments in education and health. Another, which is to de-ideologize the school, as they say, which is to purge the school from any content that leads to engagement in politics. Third, the suppression of disciplines that can contribute to their criticality, such as philosophy and sociology. And I have seen that before. when I went to school in Brazil, there was a complete purging of those disciplines. You just wouldn't have engineering and history together. I mean, there was a complete maneuver that was done then. It's done in the same way, with a different model now, but it's the same principle. And of course, the foreign ministry in Brazil is now completely geared away from collaboration in South America and subservience to Washington. So there's a direct relationship. But more than that, what I wanted to drive home here is that there is this absolute control over the development of a mindset. If people are shaped in a very particular way, in this way is a way that forces reliance upon themselves, this kind of internal self-responsible subject, which Wendy Brown so well described in relation to neoliberalism. If that is so, this self-reliant subject, it's not a socially engaging subject. You don't blame the system for anything, you blame yourself. So, and in that sense, what's happening there and what's happening here now are completely contemporary. So this is, I think, the problem of now. So to get back at what you brought up, Hakan, because I think this question of security and this contribution to radicalization on this imposition of security, it's only partly a result of that gesture. I think the other gesture is this purging of the subject, or the ability of becoming a political subject that's collectively engaged. We are completely isolated from each other, and in this vacuum, which is also an economic vacuum, what is left, it's the one thing people keep relating to, which is a sense of identity.